Welcome to Cheater Confessions. Let's get started with today's story. It's said that marriage is built on trust, but what happens when the foundation crumbles beneath your feet? My name is Richard, and until a few months ago I thought I had the perfect life. A great job, a beautiful wife, Claire, and a home that felt like heaven after a long day at work. But life, as it turns out, has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. Let me take you back to the day it all began to unravel. I came home late that evening. My boss, Brian Mercer, had kept me at the office until almost 9. The guy was a slave driver, but I respected him. He'd mentored me for years and helped me rise through the ranks. I walked through the door, tired from the long day, ready to unwind. "Claire?" I called out as I stepped inside. "In here," she responded from the living room. I found her sitting on the couch, her laptop open, but her focus seemed elsewhere. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected me so soon. "You okay?" I asked, loosening my tie. "You look off." "Yeah, just tired. Long day," she replied with a weak smile. It wasn't unusual for Claire to seem a little distracted. She was a freelance graphic designer with deadlines that could drive anyone crazy. We chatted briefly about our day, but before I could relax, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see Brian's name flashing on the screen. "Hang on, I've got to take this," I said, stepping into the kitchen. "Richard," Brian's voice boomed over the line. "Glad I caught you. I've got an important event this Saturday evening, a charity gala, big networking opportunity, and I need you there." "Oh, sure," I replied, though the last thing I wanted to do was spend my weekend rubbing elbows with Brian's high society contacts. "Should I come alone, or—" "You can bring your wife too if you want. These things are always better with a date." He didn't wait for my response before hanging up. Classic Brian. When I returned to the living room, Claire looked up at me expectantly. "Who was that?" "My boss, Brian," I said, dropping onto the couch beside her. "He's invited me to a charity gala this Saturday night. Apparently it's a big deal, and he insisted I go." Her eyes brightened, and a small smile spread across her face. "A gala? That sounds fun." "Not really. It's more of a work event than anything else. Could be boring." I paused, then added, "He said I could bring my wife, though. You want to come?" She hesitated for a second, but then nodded. "Sure, I'll come." "You're sure?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she said, closing her laptop. "It'll be nice to dress up and get out for an evening." "All right," I said with a shrug. "Just don't say I didn't warn you if it's dull." Claire laughed, her mood seemingly lighter than it had been earlier. As I leaned back against the cushions, I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. For now, everything seemed fine. Little did I know, the gala would be the beginning of the end. The day of the gala, Claire was more excited than I expected. She spent hours getting ready, and when I finally saw her, I was speechless. Her emerald green dress hugged her curves perfectly, the fabric shimmering under the soft light. Her hair was done up in elegant waves, and her makeup was just the right amount of glamorous. I couldn't help but think how lucky I was. "You look incredible," I told her as she came down the stairs, and her smile lit up the room. "Thanks," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I hope I'm not overdoing it." "Not at all," I replied. "You look perfect." We arrived at the venue, a lavish ballroom that smelled of fresh roses and expensive perfume. The event was in full swing, the high society mingling and chatting, glasses of champagne in hand. It was the kind of event I dreaded, the forced pleasantries, the shallow conversations. But it was part of the job, and I had to keep a good face. Brian Mercer was already there, of course. He was an imposing figure, tall and well-dressed as always. I walked over with Claire to introduce her to him. "Brian, this is my wife, Claire," I said, giving him a handshake. He took her hand in his, flashing a warm, almost too charming smile. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Claire. Richard talks about you all the time." "Nice to meet you too," Claire said, her voice polite, but I could tell she was a little nervous. Brian's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, and I saw the slight shift in his posture, that confident, almost predatory stance that I'd learned to recognize over the years. Then he turned his attention back to me. "You've got a good one, Richard," Brian said, his hand resting for a moment too long on Claire's shoulder as if to emphasize the point. Claire laughed nervously, avoiding my eyes, but I saw the uncomfortable tension in her shoulders. "Thanks," I replied, my jaw tightening. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. As the night went on, I started noticing more subtle things. Strange glances exchanged between Brian and Claire when they thought I wasn't looking. His eyes lingering a little too long on her when she wasn't looking. A private joke shared that I wasn't a part of. It wasn't anything overt, but the little moments kept adding up. Eventually, I made my way over to a group of guys from work for a while. We discussed upcoming projects, clients, and the usual office gossip, but my eyes kept darting back to Claire and Brian. At one point, I glanced over and saw them talking in a corner, laughing like they shared an inside joke that only the two of them understood. Claire's hand was resting lightly on Brian's arm, and he leaned in close to her. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way they were standing, too close, too comfortable, made my stomach churn. I shook my head, trying to focus on the conversation in front of me. It's nothing, I told myself. It's just friendly banter. You're overthinking it. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Every time I looked back, I saw Claire and Brian locked in another quiet conversation. They seemed to be getting along too well, too easily. The next few days after the gala, I noticed a shift. At first, it was subtle. Claire started spending more and more time on her phone. It was as if she couldn't put it down. Constantly texting or checking messages, her screen always turned away when I walked past. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was just busy with work or talking to friends, I reasoned. But then, she started going out more. Day by day, she'd leave in the evenings to meet friends or attend events that I hadn't heard of before. It struck me as odd because Claire wasn't usually someone who went out a lot. Most of the time, she was wrapped up in her freelance work, so any free time we had was usually spent together. But now she seemed to be making excuses to go out on her own, leaving me behind. One evening, she came home late, smelling faintly of perfume. Not hers. This was different, an unfamiliar musky cologne, something distinctly masculine. At first, I chalked it up to a mistake. Maybe she'd brushed up against someone at the event, but deep down I knew. My stomach turned as I looked at her. "Hey," I said as she stepped into the living room. "You smell different tonight. What's that fragrance?" She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Oh, it's nothing. A guy I was talking to at the event must have worn something like that." Her smile was a little too quick, a little too forced. But I didn't push it. Then she went straight to the bathroom without saying much, which was normal for her after a long day. But this time, when she emerged from the shower, something caught my eye. Her skin was still damp, but I noticed faint bruises on her hip, just below the waistband of her towel. They were dark purple, almost as if someone had gripped her too hard. The sight of them hit me like a punch to the gut. She noticed me staring. "What?" she asked, reaching up to touch the bruises. "Oh, this? It's nothing. I just bumped into something." I didn't say anything at first, but my mind was racing. Bumped into something? Those weren't just casual bruises. They looked deliberate, too specific, too deep. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and her hands were shaking slightly as she grabbed her leggings from the chair, quickly pulling them on to cover the bruises. I could feel the tension between us growing, thick and heavy, but I couldn't bring myself to press further. Yet deep down, something told me the answer she'd given was a lie. I had seen bruises like that before, on people who hadn't bumped into something. The room felt suffocating. Claire finished dressing in silence, avoiding my gaze the entire time. I opened my mouth to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched her leave the room, her back turned to me as if I didn't even exist. I stood there staring at the empty space she'd left behind, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? 2 days later, Claire said she was going out with her friends again. This time it was late in the evening, around 9. I couldn't ignore all the signs anymore. I knew something was going on, so I decided to follow her. I grabbed my keys and quietly stepped out the door, keeping my distance as she got into her car and drove away. The road seemed strangely familiar. I tried to push the feeling of dread away as I followed her, keeping a safe distance. I was sure she hadn't seen me. She was too focused on her destination. But as we continued on, my heart began to race. The route she was taking wasn't random. It was the same road I'd driven down countless times on my way to the office. I watched as she turned onto a familiar street and then parked her car in front of a building I knew all too well, the company where I worked. My stomach sank. What the hell was she doing here? I pulled my car into a nearby side street, out of sight, and grabbed my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking, but I managed to open the camera app and take a few pictures as she got out of her car. Claire stood there for a moment checking her phone before she started walking toward the entrance. That's when I saw him. Brian. He opened the main door, standing there with his hands in his pockets, his usual smug grin on his face. My heart skipped a beat as I snapped more pictures, barely able to process what I was seeing. I watched as Claire walked toward him, a slight smile on her face. She greeted him casually, but the look on his face was anything but professional. Then, just as I thought I'd seen it all, they did something that made my blood run cold. They kissed. It was brief, but unmistakable. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Claire, kissing Brian, my boss. I felt a lump form in my throat as I watched them. They walked inside together, and Brian quickly turned around, locking the front door, sealing whatever they were doing away from the outside world. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely hold the phone steady. I took a few more pictures before quickly putting my phone back into my pocket, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. They went upstairs, probably to his office. The very thought made my stomach churn. I couldn't believe it. I had followed Claire to the one place I never thought I'd find her, with Brian. As I sat in my car, parked in the dark, my mind was reeling. I felt betrayed, sick to my stomach, but more than anything, I felt lost. How had I not seen this coming? How had I missed the signs? I couldn't bring myself to leave. I just sat there staring at the building where my wife and my boss were now together, the images of them kissing replaying in my mind over and over again. When Claire finally came home, I was waiting. I'd spent the entire drive back trying to hold it together, but my anger and confusion had only grown. She walked in, her face lighting up when she saw me sitting in the living room. But the moment she saw my expression, she froze. "Richard, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern, though I could see the subtle tension in her eyes. She knew something was off. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Her eyes widened as I swiped through the photos and handed it to her. She looked down at the screen, her face paling as she saw the images. Her kissing Brian outside the building. The same smug grin he had, the way her body had been so close to his. My heart felt like it was going to burst. "Richard," she began, her voice faltering. I can explain." I cut her off, my voice steady but laced with anger. "Explain? How do you explain this?" I motioned toward the phone. "You kissed him, Claire, my boss. And you think a simple explanation can fix this?" Her eyes dropped to the floor, avoiding mine. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness." I let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake? A moment of weakness? You've been lying to me for God knows how long. And all this time, you were with him? How long has this been going on?" She didn't answer. She shifted nervously, but I wasn't going to let her dodge it. "I thought we had something real," I said, my voice breaking for the first time. "But I've been living a lie. All the signs, the time you've spent away, the distance between us, it's all been for nothing." She looked at me, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't stop myself." The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew, the woman I loved, now standing before me, unrecognizable. "I can't do this anymore. I'm done, Claire. You've made your choice." I took a deep breath. "I'll be filing for divorce. We're over." She looked at me in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. She shook her head, her lip trembling. "Richard, please, don't do this. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. We can fix this." I stood up, my chest tight with the weight of the decision. "There's nothing to fix. You've already made your decision. You chose him." As she stood there staring at me with tear-filled eyes, I knew nothing she could say would change what had happened. The trust was shattered, and whatever love I thought we had was now gone, replaced by betrayal. "I'm done, Claire," I said again, my voice steady but final. "I'll get the papers started tomorrow. Pack your things and go. You are not welcome here anymore." She didn't say a word. She just stood there, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I turned and walked out of the living room, heading toward the back door. I needed to get out of that room, away from her, even for just a moment. I stepped into the backyard, standing there in the cold, trying to make sense of everything. A few minutes later, I heard the door open behind me. Claire had packed her things and left. The next morning, I stormed into Brian's office, my fists clenched, my heart still pounding with the fury that had been building inside me since the night before. Without a single word, I lunged at him, delivering a sharp punch directly to his face. He recoiled, but I wasn't done. I threw 2 more punches, one to his jaw, the other to his stomach, watching him stagger back in his chair. Brian's eyes widened in shock, his hand flying to his face, and a mix of pain and disbelief flashed across his expression. "What the hell, Richard?" he spat, wiping blood from his lip. "You think you can do whatever you want?" I snarled, my voice trembling with rage. "With my wife? You think I don't know?" Brian's expression shifted, a smug grin creeping onto his face. "So what? You think you can just storm in here and accuse me of something?" I didn't let him finish. "It's not just about Claire," I interrupted, my fists still clenched. "It's about you abusing your position. You think you can do whatever you want just because you're the boss?" Brian leaned back in his chair, attempting to regain his composure, a smug look starting to creep back onto his face. "It's not like you're in a position to complain. I'm the one who made your career, remember?" That's when I laid it all out. "Actually, Brian, I've been documenting everything," I said, pulling a folder from my bag and slamming it down on his desk. "The emails, the expenses you've written off for personal use, even the messages you've sent to other women in the office." His face went pale, the smug expression vanishing as he glanced at the folder in front of him, panic flickering in his eyes. "I'm giving you a choice," I said, my voice steady now, cold. "You can resign quietly, or I take this to the board. Your call." The next day, Brian resigned, citing personal reasons. It wasn't a surprise, but it felt satisfying nonetheless. As for Claire, she begged for another chance. She came to me, apologizing over and over, her eyes filled with regret. But it didn't matter. The betrayal had cut too deep, and I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I filed for divorce soon after, and in the settlement, she received nothing, not a penny. She'd lost her place in my life and my trust, and I was done. Life moved on, and a few months later I was offered Brian's position at the company. It wasn't the way I'd ever imagined moving up the ranks, but there was a certain poetic justice in it. I'd taken back control, and in a strange way it felt right. Claire tried to contact me again, but by then I had moved on. The past was behind me, and I had no interest in revisiting it. Sometimes the only way to deal with betrayal is to rise above it. And that's exactly what I did. Thank you for watching.